Well, we're going to continue this morning talking about Jesus' grand design. I'm fully aware that Jesus works with every individual follower in a different way, in a unique way, but there do seem to be several commonalities in the way Jesus works with us. I'm going to speak today about one you may not have thought of before. I'm going to speak about missions mobilization. And before I'm done today, I hope I answer the question, what can I do about it? Where do I fit in? Now, my concept of giving is greatly affected by a man named J. Vernon McGee. Is there anybody in this room that's ever heard of J. Vernon McGee? He was probably the first or one of the first men to use modern technology to communicate biblical truth. He used a brand new invention, something that most people, by the time he started, might not have even had in their house yet, but over the years, it became very popular. It was a revolutionary technology called the radio. And he had a 5-year program where he would teach, starting in Genesis 1:1, and just work through the Bible in about 5 years. And he had a great deal of effect on a lot of people. The passage I'm thinking of this morning, or the story I want to tell this morning at least, is one that he told speaking on 1 Corinthians chapter 16. And in 1 Corinthians chapter 16, it's talking about giving. Paul is encouraging the Corinthian people there to fulfill their pledge towards helping the people in Jerusalem where there was a famine going on. And as he told the story, he was in a small church in the middle 1930s, and in his church was a gentleman who owned several Coca-Cola bottling plants. Apparently, Coca-Cola was one of the few companies that thrived during the Great Depression. And this gentleman had several of these bottling plants, so he was doing pretty well. He owned a ranch, and frequently Dr. McGee and this gentleman would go hunting and fishing together. And whenever they did, Dr. McGee knew that this man was going to bring up the tithe because he thought that Dr. McGee should preach on the tithe. And finally, Dr. McGee asked him, "Why do you think I should preach on the tithe?" And he said, "Well, because it's the biblical way of giving." Dr. McGee said, "I don't necessarily agree with that." He said, "Things are pretty hard right now. I think right now God is worried about people just feeding their families, and he's not asking most people to tithe. But some people are doing pretty well. And I think according to 1 Corinthians chapter 16, verse 2, we're supposed to actually give not just a tithe, but how we're prospered." He says, "I think some people could give more than the tithe." He looked at the guy and said, "I think some people should give half." And as only Dr. McGee could do, he finished the story by saying, "You know, that guy never asked me to preach on tithing again." That affected me because I looked at the whole world, and I was aware of the fact that Americans are some of the wealthiest people in the history of the world. And I was told at one point, and I checked it out, and I found it to be true, that a significant number of people, nearly half of the people on planet Earth, live on less than $1 a day. And so I began to think that maybe Dr. McGee's right. Maybe some of us that are prospered well could give more than the tithe. But I began to have a little bit of a disagreement with Dr. McGee also. I'm not thoroughly convinced that that all that is given should be given through the church. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about that tithe in maybe just a little bit if the Spirit leads. But I just wonder if we're called to give what we give over the tithe, if maybe God would be pleased if we gave some of that to missions. I suspect that there are some people that don't realize, they've never been taught, the significance of missions in God's plan. I know for a fact that the larger a church gets, this has been researched, the larger a church gets, the less time they spend speaking about missions and promoting mission support. I wonder if some people just don't understand how easy it is to support missions. But there are a few, and I have run into one or two of them in my life, that actually oppose giving money to missions. And that's something of what John is addressing in his passage here in 3 John today. In fact, if you read the whole book, it is the shortest book of the New Testament, by the way. If you read the whole book, you'll find that there was a gentleman in Gaius' hometown who was opposed to supporting missions. The passage we're going to look at this morning, the first part of this book, is John encouraging someone who was supporting missionaries and encouraging him to continue. Like I said before, this book is a personal letter from John to someone he knew, a man named Gaius. And quite frankly, we don't know any more about Gaius than what is revealed in this book. Apparently, he was someone whose name come up in a meeting John was in at some point, where missionaries were reporting on the progress they had made in their mission trips. And Gaius had helped them along, and John had heard about that. And so he's writing to Gaius now to commend him. And in verse 5, he gives that commendation. He says, "Beloved, it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God." Apparently, Gaius lived in a town that was on a major thoroughfare. And the missionaries, or I'm using the word missionaries, the itinerant Christians who were going from place to place for the business of the church, may have been carrying letters from one church to another, or they may have been carrying benevolence from one place to another to help people who were struggling financially, or they may have actually been teachers who were teaching the Word of God. And they were staying in Gaius' town overnight, maybe several days to rest while they were on their way. And Gaius was putting them up in his spare bedroom and providing them a nice evening meal or a good breakfast, and maybe even putting a few extra loaves of bread in their baggage so when they left they'd have something to eat that day. And John is saying, this is a good thing for you to do. Don't let anybody talk you out of it. And so John acknowledges this. He commends him for that kind of behavior, and then he gives the reason why we should do that. He says, because they don't have any other means of support. Verse 7 says, "For they have gone out for the sake of the name," that's the name of Jesus, "accepting nothing from the Gentiles." To us, that seems normal. As a missionary goes out, they don't normally bill for their services. But that's not the way it was in the first century. You see, in the first century in Rome, there were thousands of people moving into the Roman Empire from places in the East. Places like India, places like Pakistan, places like Iran, if we use the modern names. And they were bringing with them what the Romans called mystery religions. They were religions that didn't line up with the pantheon like the Greeks and the Romans had. And they were communicating this, and they were trying to win converts to probably similar things to Hinduism and Buddhism and Zoroastrianism and all the things that were well entrenched in the eastern part of the world. And as they were coming, they had expenses too. So what they would do is they would gather a small crowd together, and they would give their teaching and tell, all the wonders of Buddha or whatever it was, and then they would pass the hat and take a collection. And if they were wealthy enough that they could get enough, or a good enough speaker that they could get enough resources, they might go in and do what Paul did in Corinth, where he rented the hall of Tyrannus, it says in the book of Acts, and then they would sell tickets. They didn't have TV or the internet or anything like that for entertainment. They didn't even have the printing press, so buying books was a difficult thing. So for entertainment, they would go and hear these people in these halls, and they would pay a ticket just like we would going into a concert hall somewhere. But Christian missionaries didn't do that. Christian missionaries gave away their resources for free. It's one of the reasons why the Roman Empire thought Christians were all crazy, because they had a resource they could sell, but they gave it away for free. And John is reminding Gaius that the reason they can do that is because Gaius is supporting them, and other Christians are providing for their needs. And so John finishes this little short paragraph by saying that we all should support missionaries this way. Verse 8 says, therefore we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth. Not just that we ought to support them, but we ought to consider it part of our business. We ought to be considering ourselves partners with them, as if we're in the same line of work. We're just working out of a different office with the missionaries. So John is writing to Gaius to encourage him to continue the good work that he's done. But that doesn't give us a lot of insight on how, in the 21st century, we can be involved in missions work. How we can be influential, if you want to say it that way, or at least part of the work that's being done by the missionaries across the world. Now, I have had the privilege, and I do consider it a privilege, of having hosted somewhere in the neighborhood of 21 missions conferences in local churches, where we have invited 21 at different times, different missionaries to come to our church, and as the host, I got the extra time with them. I can't tell you how many seminars or workshops that I've been to on missions. I've talked to a lot of missionaries, and I made a habit out of asking them how we could best support them. Without a single exception, every last one of them said the best way you can support our mission is in prayer. I would have expected them to say something else, but every one of them wanted my prayers more than they wanted anything else I had to give. And I believe Paul agreed with that. If you remember in Colossians chapter 4, Paul is writing to a church that he has never met before. He knows no one in this congregation. He's writing in answer to a question from their pastor who has traveled all the way to Rome to ask his questions about how to deal with this church. And he's writing to them about prayer in chapter 4. Starting in verse 2, he says, continue steadfastly in prayer, being watchful in it with thanksgiving. So Paul didn't say to them, the first thing you do is go out and buy a copy of the scripture and you read it all day, every day. He didn't say go and give to the poor. The first thing he encouraged them to do was pray. And then in verse 3 he says, at the same time, pray also for us, that God may open for us a door for the word to declare the mystery of Christ, on account of which I am in prison, that I may make it clear which is the way I ought to speak. Paul was a missionary. And Paul had traveled, and he was still sharing the gospel, and the worst possible thing that could have happened to the church happened. Paul got caught, and he was in prison in Rome. And people were worried that the gospel would be hindered because Paul was not out there traveling from city to city to city to help the churches and strengthen the churches and to share the gospel. But every day, twice a day, a new Roman soldier was brought into Paul's house. He had to rent his own prison, by the way. It was a lot different back then. Twice a day, a new guard came in, and they would shackle them together. They'd have a chain about 6 feet long, and they'd put one end of it on Paul's wrist and the other end on the guard's wrist. He had a captive audience. And he would spend all day preaching to people who came in to receive instruction from Paul. And when he had a break, Paul would probably talk to them about the gospel. And the worst thing that could possibly happen was the best thing that could possibly happen. Because every one of those guards heard the gospel, and many of them received Christ as their Savior, the gift of salvation. And then they were transferred to places like England and France and Spain and Egypt. And there they shared the truth. And that's why the gospel spread so rapidly in the first 2 centuries of the Christian era. And Paul is asking the people in Colossae, who he's never met before, continue to support me, that I would have access to the right people, that the door would be open to the right Roman guard to convert them to Christ, and the message would continue to spread. And then he asked later in the same 2 verses, he says, and show me how to say it clearly. Our missionaries, like Paul, need our prayer support. I would point you to 2 other passages. One of them is in Ephesians chapter 6. At the end of the teaching on the spiritual armor, Paul says, and continue in prayer, as if prayer was the battlefield that we're supposed to use that armor on. And then he said, and also pray for me, that I would have boldness to proclaim the message the way I should. And again in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3, verse 1, he asks that he would be delivered from those who would resist him. So being me, the way I do things, I put those in alphabetical order. Access, boldness, clarity, and deliverance. And those of you who attend our Wednesday night prayer meeting know that we have the missionaries on there every week, and I pray every week for them for those 4 things. We can all pray for missionaries. But a couple of other things that they need. One is personnel. They need people to help them proclaim the gospel. They need people to help them proclaim the message. I would instruct you, if you'd like to sometime, look up Romans chapter 10, verse 15. Many of you know this. I'm going to go ahead and start here at verse 13 so that you get the context. Paul is writing to the Roman church, and he says, for everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. How then will they call on him in whom they have not believed? And how are they to believe in him of whom they have never heard? And how are they to hear without someone preaching? And then verse 15 says, and how are they to preach unless they are sent? And then he quotes an Old Testament passage to prove it. He says, as it is written, how beautiful are the feet of those who preach the good news. In one of those missions conferences, I had the privilege of meeting a man who was a missionary at the Bongolo Evangelical Hospital in West Africa. It was a hospital that set back off the coast quite a ways. It was back in the wilderness, we would call it. They call it the forest. And he came to a church that I was attending at the time, and he gave the most miserable presentation I'd ever heard. It was terrible. He had no great stories to tell. He had no great conversions to speak of. He had no great relationships to talk about. And beyond that, he was just not a good public speaker. I felt so sorry for him. We invited him to go out with us for lunch after church. And I started asking him about it a little bit. And of course, I already knew this part. He was not the administrator of the hospital. He wasn't one of the doctors. He was the handyman. He was the guy who kept the generator running. He was the guy who fixed the pipes when they leaked. He was the guy who fixed the wires when the electricity didn't work right. He was quite probably the one man the entire facility couldn't function without. But he would be the last one we would think of as a missionary. I'm told that it takes anywhere from 5 to 50 people to make any given mission effective. But we don't always need evangelists. Sometimes we don't need great orators. Sometimes we need a guy who knows which way to turn a monkey wrench. And I was so thankful that I got to meet him and encourage him that we were glad that he was sent. One more thing, and I've already spoken about it. They do need patronage. You knew it was going to be a P word, right? Prayer, personnel, and patronage. Pastors don't alliterate so you can remember. We alliterate so we can remember, okay? Patronage, and that's what John's talked about, how we need to support them financially so that they can go and spread the gospel message. We can all support missionaries one way or another. What I want to ask today is, how do you want to support the missionaries? How do you want to help spread the gospel to the farthest points of the globe? Will you pray? It's easy to do. All you have to do is sign up for a newsletter. And that's easy to do. Well, sometimes. One of the ways that I have done it recently is to look on Facebook, and if you are aware of the 5 different missionaries, missions organizations that this congregation supports, most of them have Facebook pages, and you can get on there and you can see their prayer requests. However, there are a number of missionaries that are working in parts of the world where it's not safe for them to put things on the internet. And so I believe those snail mail paper newsletters are going to be valuable to the missionary movement for a number of years yet. And if you get the opportunity and you find a mission that you really want to pray for, go ahead and sign up for their paper newsletter, because you'll probably get details you wouldn't get other ways. Another way that you can support them is to manage your money. Now, I'll tell you a little story about me. When I first began to follow Jesus, one of the first sermons I heard was tithe. And I said, that's great, I'm going to tithe. And I went out and I started tithing right off the top of my check. I tithed, and 3 months later, I started getting some nice, well, not so nice letters from the people I had promised I would pay their bills. And I had to go to the pastor and say, I can't keep tithing. And he said, well, of course you can't. You've got all these bills to pay. You have promised to pay those, and it's honoring to God to keep that promise. But he said, but over time, you'll pay some of those off, and I hope you'll think about contributing some of that money to the work of the church. And so I just took from that all of us, as we start our lives, we may start in a more secular way without the teaching of the Word. As we become believers in Jesus Christ, we may already have cars that are more expensive than we can afford, or houses that are very expensive, or 5 or 6 credit cards that we need to pay off. Go ahead and pay those off. That's honoring to God too. But as you do, consider whether God would have you give some of that to His work, to spreading the message of Jesus Christ. This next point, I thought about calling it Go, but I changed my mind, and I think I want to call this Send. Because as I look out across the room, there's a number of you that could still go, but there's a pretty good number of us out here now that would have a difficult time just getting on an airplane, much less doing the work when we got there. So we could send people on short-term missions. When we hear about people who are going to an overseas missions work, that we could support some of that. Or if we can, we could go ourselves. I remember a lady that I met in Wyoming. She was a school administrator, I believe, and she planned every year to take her 2-week vacation and buy 2 sets of airline tickets. She brought 1 set of airline tickets for herself and flew to Mongolia, where she would take over the duties of administering a Christian school there for 2 weeks, and then she gave the other ticket to the administrator of the school so he could go home and see his family for 2 weeks. What a tremendous ministry to a missionary that's spreading the gospel and just needs a break. But we could also send people to long-term missions. Long-term, by the way, is from a year to your career. It might just be a year long, but it might be your whole career. And as I look at the younger generation, I see some people that are tremendously skilled. Some of those people can stand up here. We had one at our testimony night a couple months ago. Ian was up here, and he gave his testimony, and this dude had platform presence. And I actually wondered this. I said, has anybody talked to this guy about going in the mission field? He could win a lot of people for Christ with that skill that he already has. But then I got to thinking, what if I knew a young man who was just graduating from Autry Tech, and maybe he's going to be a plumber? Have we ever thought about encouraging them to consider missions? Because the mission field needs plumbers too. It's just a thought. How will you support the missions? Will you pray? Will you give money? Will you recruit? And there are some interesting results that come from this. The Bible is when you read the whole Bible, it's amazing to me the things that it says. Paul actually makes a promise directly related to this in the book of Philippians. You may remember the book of Philippians is actually a thank you letter from Paul to the Philippian church, thanking them for the financial support they'd given him while he was imprisoned in Rome, and he had to pay his own rent. He had to buy his own food. And so they'd sent him a gift, and he's thanking them for it. And then he says, he points out at one point, we'd been disconnected for a little while, and I hadn't heard anything from you, but now I'm glad that we're reconnected. And then in chapter 4, verse 17, he says to them, not that I'm seeking the gift. He's thankful for the gift, but he's not asking for more. What he really wants, he says, I seek the fruit that increases to your account. I suspect Paul was remembering the words of Jesus when Jesus said in the book of Matthew, chapter 7, not to lay up your treasures on earth where moths and rust destroy, but lay up your treasures in heaven where moths and rust do not destroy. Paul is pointing out that when you support a missionary in any way that you can, you're actually participating in their ministry, and something is being laid up for you in heaven. And that to me is amazing, that somebody like me who rarely leaves the state of Oklahoma, has only left the boundaries of the United States once, can be considered in God's eyes a missionary for supporting the work. But there's one more, even more amazing promise that comes directly from Jesus. It's recorded for us in Matthew chapter 24. It's also recorded in Mark 13 if you want to do some private study later. But in Matthew 24, Jesus has been asked by 4 of his apostles, when will you be returning to establish the kingdom, and how will we know it comes? Jesus immediately says to them, he says, don't worry about it when you hear about wars and rumors of wars and earthquakes and natural disasters. He says, the way he says it in Matthew is, he says, the end is not yet. Those are not signs of the end of the world. For some of you, that right there was worth the price of entry this morning, to hear that this is all normal in Jesus's eyes, and they're not an indication that the end is coming soon. But then he goes on to say that this gospel of the kingdom will be proclaimed throughout the world as a testimony to all nations. And then the end will come. The little word will is important here because that is not a wish. That is a statement of fact from the only one on planet Earth that knows for sure. The end will not come until all ethnic groups, that's what the word nations means. It's actually the word ethnos, and it means tribes or social groups. So, and we don't really know how God divides the social groups in the world. We may be closer to reaching the whole world than we think, but Global Disciples, who we support, has estimated that 1/3 of the people groups on planet Earth have no gospel witness whatsoever. But as we support the missionaries, as they go out, more and more ethnic groups will hear the gospel and respond, and we'll get that much closer to the return of our King. As we support missionaries, we are actually supporting the return of our King. And that is an amazing, significant, satisfying ministry to be involved in. Especially since Jesus has made it possible for all of us as his followers to support missions, either by prayer or by patronage or by personnel. We can bring back our King.